Okay, well, with that, I'm going to turn us over to Matt, and away we go.
Okay, so I wanted to, I realized that like before I used to look at my screen. So I tried a little different camera setup today. Here's hoping it looks as good as others. But so I wanted to talk a little bit today about, um, for lack of a better way of saying it, apologies. Um, Maybe even a little bit like on forgiveness. Um, and so I wanted to kind of highlight that when trauma occurs in a relationship, um, it usually happens in moments of high need. So when our needs are high, um, and somebody doesn't show up for us, if that makes sense, when there's moments of fragility, like think about it right now, like we are obviously quarantined, this whole COVID thing going on, and like my needs might be high because my ability to get my needs met um, are more difficult because of my restrictions, if that makes sense. So um, things are fragile right now. If there's been loss that's occurred, so the loss of a loved one, or the loss of a child, or it could be the loss of a job, right? Like any type of loss. If there's illness that's happening, any sort of trauma or uncertainty, in these moments, we are more susceptible to having relational trauma and or key injuries in the relationship. And so I wanted to kind of get into, obviously there, if you're in this Q&A or you're watching these videos, you have had relational trauma typically. Perhaps you've even caused the relational trauma, right? And so I wanted to talk about how maybe some of the steps in coming back from relational trauma. And if any of you have heard an apology, there are apologies that are like, okay, that felt really good. And then there's other apologies where you're like, that felt awful. In fact, I think I feel worse because it doesn't feel like a, if you will, a real apology. It sometimes we hear an apology and it's basically somebody saying to us, I'm sorry you feel bad, and I'm going to tell you I'm sorry because I want you feeling bad to go away, because that makes me feel bad or it makes me uncomfortable. But like a healthy apology, a real apology, is where we are able to feel the wound or the pain of the other person, right? But the person who needs the apology typically has to get vulnerable enough to be able to share that wound and share that pain. Now that's hard, right? It's hard to get vulnerable and share the pain, but we have to be able to, in some sense, let the other person know, here's where I'm hurting. I need you to see that I'm hurting. The person who bumped into the injury or maybe even created the injury, they have to tune in and accept that that injury happened. Now, this is where things get a little tricky. Sometimes when somebody injures me, I want them to accept that they meant to injure me. Like, I want them to accept that they did it on purpose and they feel terrible. And to be honest, in this process of receiving an apology, sometimes really the most important thing is that they accept that it happened and that they can see how they did this or how they contributed to it. But taking an unhealthy amount of accountability, it's what I often refer to as over accountability. Being under accountable or over accountable, either way doesn't actually help. We need them to work into figuring out what's the amount of accountability for this that I can own. and they acknowledge that, and then they basically acknowledge and share with their partner that they did that, or that they contributed to this pain. So I'm going to keep going unless you need me to pause there. Was that okay? So so then the person who's been wounded has to get to the core without blaming or criticizing or even defining their partner, right? And so this is where things can get a little bit difficult, because sometimes we want to define our partner. You did this bad thing, therefore you're bad, right? We've talked in the past about how that can be shame, and it's tough because sometimes we are trying to explain, and if the other person has a ton of shame, they struggle not to hear criticism or blame, or like they're feeling defined anyway, right? So it's this really delicate place where we need to share the core of our hurt and say, look, I realize this is my hurt, this is my wound, and I need you to see it, and I need you to feel it without getting caught up in your own shame and difficulty. All right, I'm going to keep going. So then, if you will, step 4, the one who injured is able to apologize and express real remorse, or express regret, sadness, or even the shame that they feel. And it's tough because apologies can't be done too quick, otherwise they don't feel genuine, and they can't wait too long, otherwise it feels like, well, that it isn't genuine either, right? It's too long. Why are you coming and finally apologizing now? So there's this delicate balance of us learning to lean in, and how and when to apologize. And then the person who's been wounded has to go and say, okay, now I want comfort, right? I've shared this hurt with you. You've acknowledged your regret, your sadness, remorse, and in some sense, like, I seek comfort. Now, recognize that comfort can look like whatever it is, right? It can just be, sit with me in this pain, hear me out. It could be a hug. It could be, just sit here with me, and don't try to fix it. And then the other person, then whatever the need is for comfort, can offer to provide that. So I just kind of went through very quickly how these steps work. And obviously in our relationships, we're constantly moving through this dance of, how do I share with you my hurt and woundedness? How do you show up and show me that you can see my pain? And those steps can, for so many couples, take a lot of time. For a lot of my partners who have been wounded, they can give a small piece of their wounding. They can give a small piece of their hurt, because if I share too much, having it dismissed becomes too painful. And so oftentimes those deep, vulnerable sharing, it can take a lot of time. It can take a year in recovery before I can really give you this deepest hurt and pain. So anyway, I'd be curious on questions and feedback and comments you guys have, and obviously any other questions on any other part of couples work in the recovery process. But anyway, Scott, what do you got for me?
Thanks, Matt. Just a reminder to everybody, ask questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. You can also use the chat feature, but I tend to go to the Q&A first. I just wanted to point out some things. Kind of early in the discussion, you mentioned it doesn't work very well when other people say, gosh, I'm really sorry you're upset. I have had apologies given to me like that, and I have given apologies like that, and they do not work. As the receiver, it pisses me off, because it's like, oh, you're blaming me for being upset, about what you did. Yeah.
Totally. And it's a really delicate, it's a delicate balance, because if you can say to somebody, in fact, a lot of times when somebody comes at me with a wound or some hurt that I've caused, or even, I mean, you can look at it and go, even frustration or discomfort or whatever might be happening for them. Sometimes I have to say, you know what, I need to know more about that. Like, can you teach me more? Can you help me understand it more? So well before I ever get to maybe apologizing, I have to ask a lot of curiosity questions. Like, I'm not even going to attempt to apologize until I feel like I have a deep understanding of where your hurt and your pain comes from, right? I can't take ownership for bumping into their wound if I don't even get it, if I don't even understand it.
Right. You didn't even know the wound was there and you didn't intend to poke it. And yeah.
Right. Now, I might start off and say, wow, I'm really sorry that I hit this wound of yours. But I'll be honest, I'm really confused. I need you to teach me more about it, right? Like, what exactly did I say, or what did I do, or what did you interpret from my behavior, right? I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it makes perfect sense. I wanted to hit on, you talked about the wounded person might need comfort. How do we know, how does that person know what kind of comfort they need, and how should they convey what they need when, if they know what they need, to the person, you know, who just apologized and might be able to give some comfort? And sometimes does that comfort need to come from someone other than the person who just apologized because there's still too much anger?
Well, you've got to look and go, okay, what is comfort, right? Sometimes with our partner, comfort is you're not getting defensive. You're not trying to justify your behavior, right? Sometimes comfort, in fact, the greatest piece of comfort sometimes is just presence, right? Like, I can sit here and hear you without trying to justify my behavior or explain myself. And so the tough part is, I think a lot of times it has taken, for me personally, it takes me some time and effort to even know what comfort I'm looking for. Sometimes I'll ask, you know what, just listen. You know, the comfort I need is, you've been providing it right now by not being more upset or angry.
Yeah. Okay.
So, but yes, there are times where I'm going to go to somebody for to ask for their apology, if you will, or for them to see my hurt. And then I'll say, thank you for hearing me. And then I'll go to somebody else and I'm like, hey, I just did this really scary thing. I just asked this person, I confronted this conflict.
Yeah.
And honestly, I just need you to tell me I'm not crazy.
Yeah.
I just need reassurance I did the right thing. And so, yeah, of course, there's nothing wrong with going elsewhere and asking for comfort.
But a
yeah,
lot of the times after an apology, we want the comfort from the person who apologized, but only if it's genuine and feels genuine.
oh, totally. And is, for lack of a better way of saying it, like, safe enough to where we think that their response is actually going to help, right? Otherwise, if we get to the comfort part and we're not sure that they can provide it, that could stir up another injury of rejection or hurt of some kind.
Yeah. I mean, I'm thinking back to when I was a kid and my sister and I would get in a fight and my mother would make us apologize to each other. And I'm sorry I hit you. And she'd say, no, say it like you mean it. I'm like, but I don't mean it. You know?
Right. I was justified in hitting you.
Give me a little while. Maybe I'll get there, but I'm not there yet.
You took my choice. No, and it's tough because, I mean, honestly, when you said that, I'm thinking, man, I've probably said that. I mean, I'm sure I've said that as a parent, you know?
Of course. Parents say that.
Right? Like, because what I want is for the repair of conflict, for essentially the attachment to occur between my kids. In fact, I mean, I'll give you an example. Okay. I always ask my kids for permission to tell stories, and this is one that I think is light enough, but it happened yesterday, so I haven't asked my kid for permission. So I'll make it somewhat vague. But I have a child who um, bought a very expensive phone and and purchased a really heavy duty case to go with it. Does that make sense? And yesterday the child was like, "Hey, I don't want to use the case anymore because my phone like is really durable, and I watched this video on YouTube about how extra durable this phone is, and my fear is just like, you're gonna drop it, you're gonna break it, and of course, and like you're gonna be hurt and upset and sad because you paid for that phone. I didn't pay for it, right? And if you break it, you're gonna pay to repair it." And all my parent fear was just like, "You're crazy. What are you doing?" So we're having this conversation, and I'm like, "No, that's ridiculous. I don't understand." The next thing you know, it becomes this argument back and forth, and we're driving along in the car having this argument, and my kid says, "Hey, you know what? I don't want to talk about this. We're done talking about this." And I was like, "Okay." And so I stopped for a second and I realized, okay, I'm failing, right? And it took me several minutes in the car to realize, how do I take accountability here for my part, right? And I ended up saying to my kid, "Hey, I think I've allowed my fear to take over." And my kid says, "Yeah, you have." And I'm not kidding you. Everything inside of me is like, "Oh," you know. So then I'm like, yep. I allowed my fear to take over, and you know what? Whatever you choose to do with your phone is really up to you. And I apologize because I need to let you figure that out for yourself, right? There was no way I could have said, "Hey, I'm really sorry," prior to me figuring out what wound did I hit here? And the wound is my kid was trying to tell me something they were excited about and these decisions that they've made for themselves. And it may just be a really simple thing, but I had to tune in and figure out, where did I blow it? And that takes a lot of work. And I couldn't have apologized. I would have dismissed the whole experience if I had tried to apologize sooner. I had to figure out where I went wrong and what buttons I hit.
Yeah. So timing, and yeah, I love that. Ask us questions. We have a lot of people here today and no questions yet. Do apologies sometimes happen in layers? That was a question I scribbled down as you were talking. Like with betrayal. I mean, does that apology have to happen repeatedly, and maybe a little layer here and a little layer here, or?
Honestly, that is such a good question. So my take on this from what I've seen is that my simple answer would be yes. If the trauma happened in layers, the apology is going to happen in layers. And I think an apology can truly only happen until the person is able to be accountable for their part in it. And unfortunately, I think accountability happens in layers, if that makes sense. Like,
absolutely.
Being able to slowly do more and more recovery work over time and understand how the principles of accountability work. I've wondered, as I'm working with people and as I've dealt with people I've been traumatized in my own life, I've wondered, how much apology can they ever really give? Because how much accountability can they ever really take on? If somebody took on all the accountability for all the pain they've caused, if there were a way for the human body to die, right, because of, if they were to recognize all the pain that they've caused other people, right, I think it could in and of itself be traumatic. Like, I don't know if there's something going on in the brain where the body says, let's slowly figure out what we're accountable for, and as we can handle it, right? And I'm not trying to make excuses. It's just this curious place that I've been where I realize that as I'm teaching people in recovery, accountability comes in layers. So my answer to that would be absolutely apologies. A real, true, heartfelt apology then comes in layers. What can they be accountable for? If that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think there's a reason. I had two thoughts pop up there. Number one, I think there's a reason that step 9 is step 9 instead of step 1, because as an addict, and I'm speaking as an addict, I needed a lot of time and a lot of work before I had the clarity, number one, and the ego strength, number two, to actually make a proper amends where, I wasn't pushing blame onto the other person, or I wasn't minimizing what I'd done, or I wasn't, I needed that. Basically, it was over a year before I got to step 9. I needed all that preparation before I was actually ready to apologize and live differently, because I think half of an apology is saying I'm sorry, and half of it is not doing it again. At least an amends is not doing it again. So I needed that time to get there, and it was layers.
Yeah, and like I guess if you're going back to 12 step, I mean, step 4 is the accountability, right? It's our inventory of everything, every harm, every wrong, I think step 4 is even where it's at, because it's like, wow, can I even start to look at all of this, right?
Right. Yeah,
then,
people put off step 4 for forever, some of them, because they can't handle it.
Totally. And so so then I guess as I'm thinking about that, right, we have to be able to even gain the awareness of what we've done before we ultimately can get to a place where we can truly feel it. And then it's leaning into each individual wound and pain before we can really own it and apologize. And you always have to be careful, because you said, well, an apology, I can't make an apology until I can promise I'm not going to do it again. And here's the hard part. I don't know that that's true, especially when you're dealing with somebody who's acting on a compulsive side, right? I can feel bad about what I'm doing, even if I don't have the skill set or the capacity to make that change yet. But what I can do is show you accountability. What I can do is show you that I'm going to be honest and not lie, or if I lie, I'm going to own up to it, right? Like, so, but I'm totally with you, right? We sometimes have that feeling of like, I won't feel like I can trust again until this never happens again. And I don't know that we can definitely learn to trust. We can definitely take an apology as sincere, even if the person is still working on figuring out how to improve, and maybe even just injure less.
Yeah, and I think that's a very good point. As a matter of fact, I counsel my sponsees, don't say it'll never happen again. Say, I'm doing this, 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 and this, because I know that it hurts people when I behave that way, and I'm taking these steps to prevent myself from doing this again in the future. Rather than saying it'll never happen again. So yeah, I agree. The other thing I wanted to bring up is trauma happens in layers, which I know you talked about a little bit. I think Christine Courtois' term is complex betrayal trauma, where she talks about this layered betrayal over and over that really builds up and leads to post-traumatic stress disorder and all those kinds of things. Do you see that, particularly with infidelity and sex addiction? Do you see this layer upon layer of trauma?
Well, yeah, because I mean, if you consider, depending on what that trauma is, right? Like, what I do know from like research, for instance, is that let's say there's infidelity in a relationship, we actually know that the lying about the infidelity will actually cause more trauma than the infidelity itself, right? And so there's a layer of, well, there's the infidelity, then there's the layer of the lying about it, then there's the layer of, not only did I lie about it, but I made sure you felt crazy about it, right? Like, I mean, there's so many different pieces. And then it can also be, man, you know, my mother passed away, and you were, you know, cheating on me while that happened, and I didn't find out. You know, it's like you went to an acting out partner instead of being with me when my mom was in the hospital. I mean, that's where, like, you get into so many different levels and layers of trauma that yeah, I mean, I think I'm more just affirming what you're saying, unless there's a piece of clarity you have there.
No, I just wanted to bring that up, and you know, I mean, that's why the apology, for me, that's why, you know, the apology and the amends and all that stuff, kind of, it's just layers, you know. I mean, in my recovery, you know, every year I pick another layer of the onion and I peel it back, and it makes me cry because it's an onion. And but you know, the onion's getting smaller the longer I'm in recovery, but it's all, there's always more onion. You know?
Right. Just when you think that, oh, you know, we're getting to a deeper depth, right?
Yeah, and it just gets stinkier because the wounds are older usually. The deeper I go, you know.
Yeah, and here's the hard part. I actually believe that if we can learn to be accountable, and this is something reasonably controversial based on the way people tell me, but the way that people respond to this when I say it, but I actually believe that attachment is born in the repair of conflict. And so we can actually have a conflict. We can have a trauma. You can traumatize me terribly. And if we figure out how to work through it, and we rebuild trust, and you do your work and I do my work, and we both find healing, we can actually have a stronger relationship now than we ever did before. And so it's the hardest thing, because the potential for connection and attachment to occur after trauma is amazing. Think about anybody you've ever gone through a really difficult time with, or you've had a really heavy conflict with, and if you've been able to get through it and work through it, even if you were like, oh, I hated them at first, and you're like, man, I've never had a better best friend, right? If you can work through conflict and have repair of conflict, then the attachment often is greater than it ever could have been before. And so it's the weirdest thing to try and say that if you both, like if I'm talking to a couple, if you both can work through this, you can come out of the end of this and go, man, I wish we never had to go through it, but we've never been stronger, and I'm not sure we could have ever gotten this strong without this difficulty within our relationship. And it's a terribly painful thing to try and say to somebody who's early in recovery, hey, guess what? You can come out stronger, because nothing feels like it can or will when you're in that much hurt and pain.
Yeah, but you know, I've seen that in my own life, and I've seen that in people that I've worked with. There's much more emotional intimacy after, for having gone through it. So we got some questions here. As a husband, is there a set amount of time when the first apology should come?
I would say that again, I'm going to go back to, you should apologize every time you're able to become accountable for your behavior and be able to feel their hurt. So as simple as I can make it, if you can feel their hurt and you can be accountable for your part in their hurt, again, you don't have to own all of their hurt, but be accountable and own the part you can. And so I would not apologize. I would say it would be way better for you to say to your spouse, I want to apologize, but I'm not ready or able to yet, because I don't think that I know enough about how I've hurt you to apologize for this. My guess is her jaw is going to hit the floor if you say that, right? Because you are at least owning that you know you're not ready to apologize or able, you might say, look, I really want to apologize. I think I need to think about this a little bit more to understand why I'm apologizing. Right? You want to blow her out of the water. Now, try not to say that just to score points, right? Try to own that and be real. So again, the amount of time you wait really has to do with, can you tune in and feel your partner's hurt and pain in that?
So there's a need for some empathy, a little bit.
Yes, and if
which will also come in layers.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you don't feel like you can feel that empathy, right, you are literally better off saying, I want to apologize because I want our conflict to go away, but I realize that'll cause you more pain. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I won't know what I'm apologizing for. I mean, yeah. I need to understand it.
Yeah, you are far better off just being accountable, and you will actually build trust by doing that. Oh, good. He's not going to apologize just because he needs time to think about this. Like, oh, okay, well, he's starting to gain accountability. Boy, maybe I can trust him a little more.
Yeah, one of the words I wrote down while you were talking earlier was honesty. In terms of, and by that I meant, like, if you're going to apologize, know what it's for, and genuinely feel bad, because if you don't, the other person's, the first thing you said was some apologies feel really good and some make it worse, and ingenuine apologies can make it worse, isn't it?
Oh, totally. Yeah. If you apologize and you don't really understand what or you're doing it for your own need, not for the hurt and wounds of your partner's need, you will actually cause more damage. Because you're doing it without awareness and potentially for selfish reasons, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, apologizing to try to calm your wife down is a bad idea.
Yes, I can't handle your emotion, so I'm gonna apologize in hopes that I'm saying and doing the right thing. You would be far better off just saying, I can't handle the emotion that's going on right now, and just owning it.
Yeah. So, okay. So in our questions here, this one is just a great example of a bad apology. I'm sorry. Him. I'm sorry. Me. Thank you for apologizing. Can you tell me why you are sorry? Him. Well, I'm sorry you're mad. Me. So you aren't sorry you hurt me. Him. No. That's my sister and I all over again.
Kudos to him for owning the no at the end, right?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, if we're being honest, there is some accountability there by him just saying no, right? And kudos for him for making an effort to apologize, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, but possibly making it worse.
Yeah, but I mean, I don't know what to say to that one. I'm kind of laughing, but and let me just say this to you who is hearing the apology, I get it. There can be some letdown there because you're excited. Oh, maybe there's some accountability here. Maybe we're making some connection to each other, right? And then you dig a little bit further only to get let down. Man, that's rough. I will say though, good job for both of you for making an attempt. But yeah, that type of apology typically is not gonna be fruitful.
No. I like this next question. How if somebody doesn't apologize to you because they have a personal disorder, I assume a psychological disorder, or they're dead? So you never received the apology, but the pain is still there.
Ooh, yeah. That's a good one right there. So that, I think, probably comes down a little bit more to, there's a little bit of forgiveness there. Some of the techniques that I'll use in therapy with a client, let's say the person that they need an apology from has passed away, like you mentioned, or they don't have the capability. Maybe they're never willing to be accountable. Maybe they've disappeared. maybe they're not safe to ask for an apology from. What I will often encourage them to do is to, sometimes I'll do like what's called an empty chair technique, where I'll ask them to sit down and ask the person for an apology. And then I'll invite them to get up and say, why don't you sit down and share with this other part of you what apology you would like to hear from this person, right? And so you almost create the scenario where you have an ideal, I'm trying to think of the word here. You have an ideal person, right? That instead of you having the real person in front of you, the person that you wish they could be for you, and then try to offer that apology and just see what that feels like. So if nothing else, you honor the apology that you deserve or that you need, rather than feeling like you can't be whole unless that person were able to offer it. Because I know people who have sought out apologies from somebody who really wasn't healthy, and it can sometimes create a bigger wound. And so I think it's important that we honor, what kind of apology do I need? What kind of apology does that part of me deserve? And learn to get that apology and honor that apology, even if that person can never do it themselves for the reasons listed or whatever else.
Yeah. And the reverse of that, sometimes, you know, addicts run into the reverse of that, where they'd like to apologize and make amends, but
right,
the person will not talk to them, or
right,
the person is deceased, or the person is not well enough, either physically or mentally, to deal with the stress of getting the amends. And, you know, we do letter writing, we do, you know, going to the gravesite and making the apology. We do all kinds of techniques, because, you know, for the addict, making amends is as much for the addict's well-being as for the other person. I mean, you know, if we stole money from them, we can pay them back. But really, as an addict, I made my amends so I could feel better about myself. And how somebody else took it, whether they accepted the amends or not, didn't matter. I made the amends. I cleaned up my side of the street. The one other suggestion I want to make is another addict trick. It deals with resentments. You know, when I have a resentment against somebody, I was taught to pray for that person to have all the good things in life that I want in my life, and to do that morning, noon, and night for 30 days. And I always get a little resentment about having to do that for somebody I have a resentment against. But then, you know, somewhere around day 15, my resentment lifts, the anger lifts, the pain lifts. And that has worked for me. I can't say that it works for everybody, but it has certainly worked for me. I had to find a way to let go, because I was never going to get my apology from them.
Yeah. No, and I think that's I think a beautiful, another beautiful technique for trying to, you know, whether it's prayer, whether it's even doing a meditation around that, maybe in your heart for that person, right? However it is you choose, ultimately we have to learn to forgive, even if we don't ever want to be around that person again. Right? We have to learn to let go of that pain within ourselves. It doesn't mean we ever have to connect with that person or be near them, but we have to figure out however to let that pain out.
Yeah, there's a book called The Screw Tape Letters by C.S. Lewis, and it's letters from the head devil to his apprentice devil, who happens to be his nephew. And he's explaining to the apprentice devil, you know, resentments, don't look for big resentments, look for little resentments. Just get under their skin a little bit, and you've hooked them, and you own a piece of their soul forever. And, you know, I let go of my resentments, not because I want to forgive the other person, not because I want to be the better man. I just don't want them to own a piece of my soul. So I let go of the resentment. However, whatever I have to do, I get rid of it, because I don't want them taking up space in my head that they don't deserve.
And for those of you who find that difficult, let that take as much time as it needs to take, right? Like, I think sometimes somebody who's injured us might be like, well, when are you going to forgive me? And it's like, well, I'll forgive you when I forgive you. Like, this process, that's mine, right? That's mine to release. And I don't think there should be any shame or guilt about that taking a while, right? There are a lot of injuries and a lot of wounding. I have some trauma that occurred to me when I was a kid, and every once in a while, that pain comes up, and I feel the frustration, the anger, the hurt around it, and I think I have to actively let go of some of that all the time. I have to choose to not let that stay underneath. But we make the mistake that maybe forgiveness hasn't occurred because we still feel the pain. And I think that's absurd. I think the pain reminds us maybe that we need to not go back to a place of being unhealthy or being vulnerable in a way that isn't going to be healthy in a relationship. So I hope that makes sense. Like, I think it's important for apologies to happen, right? I think it's important for forgiveness to happen. But at the same time, it's a journey.
So, speaking of journeys, let's go to our next question. I agree that we betrayed spouses don't want a half-assed apology or an insincere one. However, I sometimes feel like I'm banging my head against a wall, trying to get my husband to understand how he hurt me. What can I do to try to help him understand? Excellent question.
Oh, it's a fantastic question. So the hardest piece about getting someone else to understand is, how do I say this? I think is figuring out how to be truly vulnerable. So the more I can share the actual hurt with the person I need the apology from, the more likely they are to be able to tune into it. So to give you an example, a lot of times when I'm hurt or frustrated, the emotion that's on the surface is anger or frustration, and that's what I'm sharing with somebody else. And so naturally their response is going to be defensiveness, if that makes sense. And so if I can like simmer that down, like even using the example with my kid that I was sharing, I had to like go and look beyond what are my fears and frustrations, because I wasn't wrong in what I was trying to explain to my kid, but I had to get deeper to go, okay, how do I get vulnerable about what's actually happening here? And it wasn't until then that in this case, my kid was able to tune in and go, okay, that's valid. I'm still going to make my choice, right? So the tough part about getting vulnerable is that there's greater risk. So if I tune into my hurt and pain and can really show up, and I would actually say that if you're trying to share with your spouse your hurt, do it in chunks, in pieces. Try and make it as like bite-sized as possible, because if I take this long list of grievances, which is totally justified, it can sometimes be way too overwhelming that the other person has too much of their shame come up or whatever, that they don't tune in to what I'm really needing emotionally. And so I've found that to get the best apology, I have to be as specific and as vulnerable as I can on that need. So I don't know if this answers the question well enough.
Yeah, I think it kind of hits on it. And I just wanted to add, and I think we've talked about this in this webinar before, but addicts struggle with empathy. And, for a proper apology, the person apologizing needs to understand what's going on. And, addicts, we're just not very good at it, especially early in the process. It's a slow build.
Yeah, I've said it before, I think on this webinar. it is the hardest thing in the world, because sometimes I have to tell a partner who's been betrayed that unfortunately there's a good amount of recovery work that he's going to have to do, or she, right, for that matter, that there's a certain amount of recovery work that they are going to have to do in order for them to really even be able to be empathetic and tune in. And there's certain pieces, and you'll get glimpses of it. And I would argue that it's those glimpses that keep you in the relationship, right? If you aren't getting glimpses of it, then you feel hopeless. And oftentimes we abandon the relationship because we feel no hope. And so you're getting glimpses of it. You can see it in small moments, and you're thinking, when am I going to get more of this? And so you hold on to those glimpses, or in this, this last, at what was referred to as the, this half apology, this insincere apology, you're going to get that. And it's almost like, look, I'll take that, right? I'll gladly take this somewhat insincere apology, because that's better than nothing, because that gives us some hope. And then it takes time as they're doing their recovery work. And as you're saying, Scott, they get their empathy, they start gaining emotional tolerance, the ability to tolerate their own shame, their own emotion. They start getting more emotional tolerance, the ability to tolerate your pain and your hurt. And as they do that, then their apologies become more tuned in and more sincere. But yeah, if they're struggling with empathy, they certainly are going to struggle with an apology.
Yeah, and I think this is why the apology, I think you said, when somebody asked, when should the first apology come? And you said apologies could come anytime I forget your wording, but basically anytime.
Accountable.
Yeah, anytime you're accountable and understand what's going on, and, anytime you really feel it.
Yeah, any moment of empathy, right? I mean, there's been times where, I remember I made a dumb mistake. My wife and I experienced a miscarriage early in our marriage, and I was a young husband and just didn't quite understand how that would have impacted her. And I was kind of just not as sensitive as I needed to be. And I'm telling you, over the years, my empathy for that moment has hit me to where there's moments where I'm like, hey, like, you may not need it, but man, I've just been thinking about it lately, and I just want you to know I'm sorry. It hurts me that I just didn't get it, right? Empathy and a deeper understanding of the pain happens over time. And there's times where I've had to ask my wife, like, do you need me to not apologize for that anymore if I feel it, right? Like, are we good there, or should I bring it up anytime? If that makes sense.
And I think that's part of the deeper intimacy that you were talking about earlier. It can happen years down the road. Wounds can be healed, or you can learn more about each other. Like, no, I'm over it. You can shut up now, or whatever. But there's a deeper intimacy with that you really know something important about each other.
Oh, totally.
That you would never have known without that conflict.
Absolutely.
So let me ask this question, and this is one that I get from my male sponsees all the time. All my sponsees are male, but and sex addicts. And how many times do I have to apologize? I feel like I apologize over and over and over, and all she does is get mad. And it's like we make a little progress, and then she gets mad, and I apologize, and she doesn't believe I'm sincere, and all of this. How do you counsel somebody like that? How do you help somebody work through that?
It would be a beautiful opportunity for him to tune into what she's experiencing, right? So if he can take that back to her and say, hey, I've noticed that in my attempts to make an apology, you get upset. And I'm honestly a little confused because I've tried to be sincere, but you still seem to be getting upset. Can you help me understand why that brings up hurt or upset for you? Right? Like, because I don't know that I would tell him, well, you just keep apologizing until she's okay with it. Like, I would say, no, I would lean in and ask her, I want to understand why my sincere apology at this moment doesn't feel like it's helpful to you. That's really confusing to me. So I'm not gonna apologize because I don't want to keep causing you hurt. And so until I can figure out why me apologizing is causing you um, emotional disruption, emotional escalation, that's the word I'm thinking of, right? Unless I can figure that out, I don't even think apologizing is helpful for you or me. I would tell, yeah, lean right into that.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I tell them is it may not be your apology that's triggering the situation. I mean, betrayed partners and recovering addicts kind of ride an emotional roller coaster for a year or so. While we learn to trust and while we learn to be honest and betrayed partners learn to trust. And, we're not always at the same place on the same roller coaster. I mean, I may try to apologize at the exact wrong time. It could be a perfectly good apology for a perfectly good reason, just at the exact wrong time.
Well, and I think that one of the things I actually, like, if you will, the first step that I talked about was that the person who's hurt has to, I think, be vulnerable to actually hear the apology, right? Like, and so if you can't tune into your partner to say, hey, can we talk about the hurt that I've caused you, right? Then you've got to be careful because your apologies may just feel dismissive, right? Unless the wounded person is in a vulnerable place, I'm not sure apologies actually make sense. So either you get them to a vulnerable place where they can feel the pain because you're saying, hey, can we talk about something? Can we talk about how much I've hurt you around this thing? Are you open to it? And if he or she's like, no, I don't want to go there right now. Okay, well, I have something I want to share. You let me know when you're ready. Or I'll bring it up again some other time soon or whatever, right? Like, but the person I think needs to be open to actually receiving an apology. We can't just go like dump our apology on them and be frustrated that they didn't accept this gift we were giving them. In that moment, they didn't ask for the gift. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I think that's very, very good advice, and I'm going to steal it when next time I find, like, did you ask if they were open
brother. You take it. You don't even have to quote me on it.
Yeah, no, I was always told when you quote somebody, you credit them the first 3 times, and then it's yours. So, I'll credit you 3 times, and then I'm keeping it.
And then I'm keeping it. That's funny.
So let's see what we got in the chat feature here. LOL. Yes, there we go. Why is my apology not helpful? Maybe because they don't mean it. They are apologizing to make themselves feel better. I mean, we kind of hit on this earlier, but yeah, that's the wrong reason to apologize.
Yeah, no, absolutely. You've got to look at what your motivation is in the apology. And I think, even though I just said it, if we go back to that concept that like an apology is a gift, and if somebody's not open to receiving it, don't try to force the gift on them.
And I love saying, are you open to talking about the hurt that I've caused you? Because that kind of takes me as the apologizer out of the mindset where I'm trying to make myself feel better. I want to acknowledge what I did and apologize for it, like genuinely. Right. I mean, I can't ask that question and not have my mindset go there. I mean, that's an acknowledgement that, yes, I'm acknowledging up front that I hurt you. Are you open to talking about that?
And you also have to look at like the circumstance, right? Like if you're driving home from work and you suddenly have some empathy and compassion for your spouse and you are able to take accountability and you're feeling some sadness around it and you want to share that with your spouse and you call them up and you can hear a bunch of kids screaming in the background or you can hear a bunch of coworkers or whatever, don't say, hey, I have something I want to share with you. I'm just worried right now is not a good time. Or if you're sitting there cooking dinner and you suddenly have some empathy and compassion and you know what, there's a lot of chaos going around, you might want to ask, hey, I have something I think is important for me to share. Is now okay? I want to apologize about something. Is now a good moment? And they could say yes, and then you share, and then they're like, wait, you know what? Can we revisit this later? That's okay too. Right? They can say yes and then change their mind right in the middle of it.
Yeah,
So
and that's how real connection works, I think.
totally.
So, well, we've got like 2 minutes left, so we might as well wrap up here. Matt, do you want to do like a quick summary about apologies and forgiveness? We actually stayed on topic for a whole hour. That's amazing. You want to do a quick summary for us?
Yeah, the way a Q&A works is we're willing to go whatever topic somebody asks about, but I guess it's hard to summarize, right? We talked about a lot of really good things, but I think being honest in your reasoning for apologizing, maybe even being honest with yourself about why you're seeking an apology from a person is really important to lay the groundwork to then say, hey, can we now take these vulnerable steps to then actually repair conflict between us? So I think it's important that we learn to figure out what's going on for us. Why am I asking for this, or why am I doing it? Can I be vulnerable? Can I get down to the softer parts of myself and share that? Can I hear the softer parts that the person is sharing? Can I be accountable for my part in it? Don't be over accountable. Don't take on more than is yours, or more than you're even able to take on. Don't be under accountable and try and dismiss it. And then acknowledge the hurt and pain that you can acknowledge, right? Do this in layers. And then the person, as best as you can, accept the apology, even if it's just accepting it for as little as it might be. I appreciate the attempt. And then the ask for comfort. Hey, and asking for comfort, you just got to be open to what that is. Like, hey, thank you. Can we just sit here for a few minutes and just, be silent? Can you hold my hand? Whatever that might look like. And then offer comfort. Hey, and so if somebody doesn't ask for something, say, hey, are you open to a hug? Are you open to me holding your hand for a minute? You can offer comfort as long as you recognize that that person doesn't need to accept it. And that's okay. So that would be my quick summary, and it looks like we landed right on the dot.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, everybody.